Gurmagat. Minister, as has been said by others, it is very important that we get this legislation right. It's important that legally that we have clarity, that we are clear that procedurally what we are agreeing to will work. And this is because, of course, we have had the awful experience, the women and their families have had the awful experience of the cervical check scandal. But as my colleague, Deputy Tully, has referred to there, that is not the only scandal, the only hardship and heartbreak that has emerged as a result of the resistance of the system or systems to simply provide information. Just want to recall at this point, Minister, that this legislation is all about information, the provision of information. It's not about malpractice, it's not about establishing negligence, it's not about any of those things which require separate legal processes, as you are aware. So in that spirit, I think we need to come at this looking to maximise information flow, access to information for the woman, for the patient. And I say that because culturally, within the system, the reflex action, it seems to me, is not to tell. I think we have all of the evidence of that. I don't know if you would agree with that assessment, but I think that's what the evidence shows us, that the system is conservative or anxious to protect itself, to protect its staff, and not to tell. The system, furthermore, even when mistakes are established, its next reflex is to fight those odds, very often through the courts. The women and their families have had that experience indeed. Some will go into court tomorrow on this. Stephen Teep, I understand, the widower of Irene Teep, the late Irene Teep, is in court tomorrow. So that's the second instinct. So we have to be very real in formulating this legislation, that we have to provide the legal basis, the procedural certainty, but we also have to be real about the culture in which this legislation will operate. So the reason, Minister, that we are zoning in on this legislation and taking through your paces on this is simply because we want to be sure that we get it right. And there are several parts of this legislation which we don't believe yet that you have it right. And we want to work with you to correct that. To my mind, a positive duty of mandatory disclosure and of candour places the onus, the burden of responsibility on the system, the clinician, the service provider. That's what it does. If it simply places an onus or a burden on the woman or the patient, in the case of other screening services, well then, what is that? Not just legally, but operationally, what does that say to the system? I ask you that question. I think the right to review, and I acknowledge that this was consulted on widely and this is the advice that you have been given. I think that is an excellent opportunity for women, for patients. Absolutely. But it is problematic that the legislation doesn't state as a matter of obligation that the woman, the patient, must be told, informed of their right to that review. I think you should correct that in the legislation. I think your proposal to move to an anonymised, I struggle to say that word, anonymised look back or audit is also problematic. And if you think about it, in legislation and a system that is all about recognising the right of individuals, not numbers or statistics, but real women, real patients, to the right to their information, isn't there something kind of ironic and almost inappropriate in anonymising in totality that process? I think that's a mistake. In fact, if we just think about Vicky Phelan's experience, and her name echoes throughout this debate, had the look back at that stage been anonymised, and of course it wasn't, but had it been anonymised, would the information of the error in reading her slide ever have found its way onto her medical records? No, but she was entirely unaware. That review process, that's a separate issue. In an anonymised scenario, would that information have found its way onto her files? And the answer to that question is no. The answer to that question is no. I think if there is a concern around an entirely anonymised system, I think you can find a halfway house in that, and you can give women and patients a choice. You can give them a choice in respect of any future lookbacks as to whether or not their sample, their slide would be anonymised or not. And I would suggest to you, my instinct is that most people, when we were talking about information and clarity and transparency and accountability, would prefer that the system not be anonymised. And I have to say, I am not convinced by the argument, and I've heard it rehearsed, that if the look back is not anonymised, that it will collapse the whole screening system. I don't buy that, because I remember a time when all of the controversy and the women speaking out and defending their corner, that too was cited as a potential danger or menace or jeopardy to the entire screening system. And not alone did that not prove to be the case, as a matter of fact, and I think the data reflected it, in fact, more, not less, went for screening. Because all of us on all sides of the House, and again, Deputy Tully has said it very clearly, we want people to avail of the screening services. So, Minister, I hope that you will agree to further amendments to this legislation. I don't think you have gotten it to a point where we could, hand on heart, say, this does the job. And I had, Cathaoirleach, finally the opportunity to talk to some, not all, some members of the 221 group, and they share many of the concerns and some more concerns than I have expressed in respect of this legislation. So okay. I would appeal to you that you open your mind and that you move to correct the deficiencies in the legislation.
The Minister to respond, please.